Hey, everybody, welcome back to In Case It Happens. I am your co-host, John Darr with Darr Schackow Insurance, and I'm here with my friend Marie Banks. Hey, Marie.
Hey, John, how's it going?
Good. Marie is with Schackow and Mercadante, a law firm based in Gainesville, Florida. And in this podcast, we are going to go into the perils of
Oh no.
owning a Fido, owning a dog, we're going to talk a little bit about animal liability because insurance, there's a little bit of a twist there with animal liability because, as Marie will tell you, sometimes it's not always about the dog biting somebody. Sometimes dog bite claims are not where the dog bit anybody. So anyway, hopefully we'll make this interesting. In case this happens to you, you'll be smarter about all the things that are animal liability. So what you got for us today, Marie?
All things dog. Well, I first just want to say, I know that at least here in Gainesville, we have a huge dog loving community, which is why John and I thought this was an important topic to talk about because as I would imagine, a lot of people don't really understand where their responsibility falls if they own a dog. And so the law in Florida states that if you own a dog, you are responsible for anything your dog does, even if you didn't expect or suspect that your dog could do it. So that's something that's very different than other types of negligence laws in Florida. Usually I have to prove that, someone had a duty, they breached that duty, it caused harm. So that's where a lot of the car accident stuff comes into play. You were supposed to drive the speed limit, you didn't stay in your lane, things like that. With a dog, it's called strict liability, which just simply means your dog does something to hurt someone, you're liable. And it's a little bit scary if you don't know that, because that means you're responsible for someone's injuries if your dog bites them, or if your dog runs out into the yard, into the sidewalk, gets excited with another dog and things get tangled up, that, person falls and injures themselves. There's no dog bite involved, but they would view that as a dog attack and you're responsible. So I have a lot of questions for you, John, because when you have something like this where it's a strict liability, the owner of the dog is responsible no matter what your dog does. You might think you have the nicest dog in the world, or like a lot of our community, you probably have a rescue dog. You've rescued a dog who maybe came from a bad situation. Maybe they were abused and you have a lot of compassion for your dog. But I've heard a lot of stories, and I'll share one of our cases with you in a few minutes. But I think that our viewers and our listeners really need to understand, oh man, this is putting me at risk. If you're someone who has assets, you make money, you've got money in the account, you got to know how to protect yourself in the event that your dog bites somebody or attacks someone.
That word anything is it's a pretty big word. And the crazy part is, do you know what the percentage of people that own a dog in the United States is? I thought this was interesting.
No, I would think it'd be high because we love our dogs in America. Treat them like
Yes. So it's 44% in the United States,
wow.
but in the state of Florida, it's about the same. It's about 40% in the state of Florida. A lot of that is probably because some retirees, don't have dogs. But I know for a fact, I'm a dog lover. I love all dogs, and there are a lot of households that have dogs, and yeah, to your point, anything's a big word, and people don't realize what kind of responsibility. And with insurance, we refer to it as animal liability. It's not dog liability, it's animal liability. And there are still a couple, and I'd say a couple, I don't even think there's a few. I think there's a couple carriers that will include animal liability on their policy, and there's typically a sublimit. So it's usually under $50,000, that sort of thing. Um, Last year, there was $1.12 billion paid out in animal claims
Wow.
alone in 2023.
Wow, that's a high number.
It's a huge number. There were 4.5 million incidences where somebody was injured and needed care.
Now, are
So
those just animal liability policies, or is there any situation where it's just straight homeowners policy? There's not this little subcategory. Will a homeowners policy pay for dog?
probably not. So my advice, as always, is check with your agent to see what the heck you've got and what you don't have, but probably not. The insurance companies are very well aware of the strict liability when it comes to animals. So they have tried to get off of a lot of that, as you might imagine, the darn insurance companies. And now we have separate policies that we can buy if you have a concern. So it's typically not included, but there are policies out there that do include animal liability. So it's a separate policy. Typically, it's not included. But again, check with your agent and find out what your homeowner's policy has.
You would pay a separate premium, or it would get like
Yeah.
if someone owns a dog
Yeah.
and they're getting homeowners insurance, maybe they're moving to town or they're moving to a different home in Gainesville, do they need to tell their insurance company or their agent, hey, we have a dog or we have this many dogs? Is that really, I mean, I would think it's important. And of course, an agent won't know unless you tell them, sort of a thing. But is there an
Yep.
obligation? If they don't tell them, it just sounds like there might not be coverage if something happens.
I mean, if they have there are certain dog breeds that insurance companies have in their underwriting guidelines that will make that homeowner maybe not eligible for the policy altogether. So,
Wow.
so some of the carriers were like, look, we don't want to write if you've got, the typical pit bull, German Shepherd, not all of them, but there are some.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, I work with your agent, call your agent, say, hey, here's what I've got. I'm concerned about it. I'm worried about it. And the examples of claims will surprise people, because we had one claim where we had a rather small individual, adult, but she was, she probably didn't weigh 100 pounds. And she loves dogs, and she walks into this household. I think she was babysitting or something. And this homeowner had a wonderful yellow lab, big, clumsy, lovable, would never bite anybody type of a yellow lab.
Mm-hmm.
And when she came over, the yellow lab got excited and jumped up and knocked her down and broke a collarbone.
Oh, man.
And licked her to death, like literally. So that's a perfect example of, hey, there's somebody's injured.
Wasn't a vicious attack.
It wasn't a vicious attack. It wasn't, nobody did anything on purpose. It was just an innocent situation where, now somebody's injured and they got to go to the hospital. They got to go, to emergency care. They've got to, the bills start racking up. And homeowners insurance doesn't necessarily always cover that. So,
and I'm telling you, from the lawyer's perspective, the owner's responsible for those.
Yeah, it's clear.
If this sweet little woman so chooses, she could sue that person. Now, that may not happen 9 times out of 10. It might be a friend, family member. They don't want to bother with that. That's fine. But you can't guarantee, and you don't really know. And I'm also thinking, as you're talking about this, sweet woman who's 100 pounds, children, who are coming into the house a lot, and this big dog,
concussion,
they hit their head on the coffee table, whatever it might be. It's not just, like you said, the vicious breeds biting.
It's very common, and definitely, I don't know. I have a question about, from the attorney side, being strict liability. Does it just go into a situation where you go, okay, We know you're liable. We don't have to determine that. We just are going to try to figure out what the compensation is. What is the settlement going to be? Is that typically what happens?
Yes. So generally, if somebody comes to us and they have an incident, we're looking at the extent of injuries, because the extent of injuries is going to largely determine what type of compensation they should receive. If we're talking about, oh, you fell down, you bruised your, leg, couple of scratches, nothing really major happened, it's probably not worth it to pursue a claim.
Mm-hmm.
And if that person really, really wants to pursue it, we may or may not choose to. But we're investigating. So we're always investigating what type of coverage is there. So a lot of times we're writing a letter to the homeowner. Please send this, copy of this letter to your insurance carrier. Give us your insurance information. And the homeowner obviously has to decide, am I going to cooperate with this attorney? If you don't, you run the risk of being personally sued in court and having to show up and either hire a defense attorney, which is going to cost you money, or try to defend yourself against an attorney. That can be hard sometimes, but you're on the hook. And so it's best to cooperate, I say, especially if you have homeowners insurance. And then we're going to have a conversation with the adjuster. We're going to find out, is there any coverage? Sometimes there's not. Sometimes, like you said, this insurance company didn't know they had a dog.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really what we're trying to figure out. So in one of our cases, I'll tell you about the interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We represented a woman who was just walking down the street with her two, they're Labradoodles or something like that. Really great, beautiful dogs. And out of this house, well, I think it was down the street, but a dog had been let out unintentionally. Dog was out running through the neighborhood and attacked one of her dogs. Real vicious attack on the dog, not her. But she was trying to get the dog off, and then another homeowner comes out and they finally get the dog under control. And in that process, her dog is in critical condition. She had fallen and I think broken a bone. Maybe it was in her wrist, or she injured her knee too. She had some injuries just from the scuffle.
Mm-hmm.
And so we found out who the dog owner was. We sent, a letter of representation to them, their insurance carrier. They did have one of the animal liability, sub policies. There was only $25,000 on it. Her injuries were, the value of her injuries exceeded that 25,000.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, because she had to have a surgery and various things, and she had a high vet bill for her dog, which we were able to seek compensation for her animal that had to have a few procedures done as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we were able to get that 25,000 from the policy, but essentially that insurance carrier said, that's all we have. That's all we contracted for with this person. We found out that the person who owned the dog was living and staying in a home that wasn't hers. It was owned by someone else. Now we have a landlord situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now we're investigating, does this landlord have any responsibility for this dog being let out? And our investigation revealed that the landlord had himself been on the property and he was the one who left the door open.
Oh, geez.
The dog got out. And so actually his homeowner's policy, which I think might have been attached to a different home, his homeowner's policy ended up paying for his negligence. That's a bit of a different claim. He's not strictly liable. We had to prove he was negligent in some way.
Right.
Did. And his homeowners, and I don't know that every homeowner's policy would do that. He had a good carrier who wanted to protect him. And so they ended up paying out a substantial amount because of his negligence and his involvement. And had he not left the door open, dog wouldn't have gotten out. So there's just a lot of different
folks out there listening. That's the sign of a great attorney. So you've just,
my client was happy.
You've just seen or heard an example of what a great law firm will do for their clients, because there's so many different.
I give all the credit to Brian Schackow on that one. That was his.
There you go. Right. There you go.
He never gives up. He never gives up. So I think, and one question I wanted to ask you, make sure we had a chance to talk about it, is that landlord tenant situation. So for our landlords out there, we've got a lot of those in Gainesville, people who own properties, maybe college students renting them, grad students, things like that. I've seen a lot of leases that talk about pets.
Mm-hmm.
And you obviously have to let your landlord know if you have it. From an insurance perspective, what types of things should landlords be telling their carriers, and will they be on the hook for owning the house?
Yeah, good question. So some of them provide, some of them give the ability for their tenants to have pets and have dogs, especially. And that's fine. What we recommend folks do is, just like it's a great idea to have the landlord recommend or require the tenant to have a tenant's policy. If they've got pets, we also suggest that they have the tenant get an animal liability policy, because it just creates that one layer of protection between, hey, this is what happened. The landlord's probably not going to be held responsible.
Right. And I would agree.
But in your case, you gave a great example of, hey, the landlord let the door open. So it's one of those deals. But it just gives you, it's just a smart thing to do, is to require them to have a tenant's policy, and they've got animals. Hey, go get an animal liability policy. It's typically, now I will say, the animal liability policy is probably going to be more expensive than the tenant's policy, but there's a lot more risk there when it comes to animals. So,
and I would agree with you. I think in general, a landlord's not going to be responsible. An absent landlord who's, just owns the home, they're not in there opening doors, leaving gates open, things like that. And so it's usually going to always come back to that strict liability of the owner of the dog. But, there are some situations where a landlord might be leasing the property to their daughter or their son or something like that. It might get it's a little tricky. And so I think, since we're called In Case It Happens, let's talk a couple minutes, wrap up on how people can prevent, these situations from kind of ruining their lives. I think one is, if you have a dangerous dog, and I would, we all know the classic breeds that are considered. You already mentioned pit bull, a German shepherd, and there are a lot of landlords who don't even let you bring those animals onto their premise. But if you have a big dog that you might be concerned about, I think it's really important, especially if they stay outside, you need to be putting signs up. No trespassing, dangerous dog. Give all the warning you can. You're much more likely, even though it's strict liability, if you're putting all the warnings out there, you have a better argument for not having to pay for any damage if someone comes onto your property and, gets injured by your dog. Now, you are responsible if you've got like the utility person or cable, someone who needs to come on your property. You do need to be keeping your dog locked up and prevent them from getting injured.
I think that's great advice for sure. And I have a special guest. Our first special guest is going to join us on In Case It Happens. Hold on just one sec.
Uh-oh.
Just to prove that I am a dog lover. This is Lulu. Now, Lulu
couldn't hurt a soul.
She could not hurt a flea, but she has the loudest bark in the history of all barks. So one of the claims that we had was a bigger dog than Lulu. Don't tell her she's little, because she doesn't think she's little. But anyway, ran out to the edge of the yard and stopped. They had an invisible fence. Oh, we're boring, Lulu. They had an invisible fence, and this dog ran out to the edge of their yard. A bike rider was coming by, scared the bike rider to death, and down goes the bike rider. And so the dog never left the property, and the bike rider never actually was on they were always in public right of way, public property. They settled the case for $10,000. So for those out there listening, in case it happens, that's exactly an example of why it's important to have animal liability.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah. It's so important to talk to an agent. I mean, same thing we said with the golf carts. You own a dog, you should have an insurance agent you're talking to, and you're asking these questions, and you're making sure, because a lot of the time a $25,000 little policy thing is going to be sufficient for anything.
right.
And I think that's what your agent's there to help you. She's out of here. But that's what your agent's supposed to help you figure out. How much should I?
I told you she was loud. Lay down.
That's incredible.
So anyway, yes. Hey.
Well, another exciting episode. Thank you, Lulu, for joining.
Yes. Thanks for joining us. I'm John Darr with Darr Schackow. I'm here with Marie Banks and Schackow and Mercadante in Gainesville, Florida. And of course, it's perfect that this episode was interrupted by a barking loud dog. I think that's very apropos. So
make sure you subscribe. Feel free to leave any comments if you have questions or anything like that. We hope to bring you some more interesting tales so that you can be prepared in case it happens to you.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching. See you next time.